Hello, I'm Jack Shanahan, and this is my final presentation for British literature on nature and the divine in romantic poetry, a comparison of Mont Blanc by Shelley and God's Grandeur by Hopkins. So first thing we have to go into is time periods, similarities, and backgrounds. So Percy Bysshe Shelley was a heavy romantic poem, one of the big six. He wrote in the early 1800s. That's where most of his famous works and his famous writing is. Hopkins came later in the Victorian period, but his poetry is still very heavily influenced by Romanticism. They both lived in different time periods, but both poets were very fascinated by nature. Shelley looks at nature as a mysterious and powerful force that holds many deep truths and that can't really be understood by humanity fully. Hopkins, on the other hand, sees nature as a demonstration of God's presence and grace. In this video, I want to show how their approaches to nature, spirituality, and human understanding are similar, but the outcomes of that, they're very different. So, starting with Mont Blanc by Percy Bysshe Shelley, he was actually inspired by the actual mountain of Mont Blanc in the Alps. This poem was written in 1816. Shelley describes it as something beyond human understanding, like this big mountain, and the way it was created is something that humans will never understand. One of the quotes from his poems is, "The everlasting universe of things flows through the mind." This line shows how Shelley sees nature as something flowing through our minds, but not something that we can really fully grasp, not like a tangible thing. It's not even like an emotion. It's something that's in the distance and that we can't really connect with. For him, nature is very close to divinity. It's almost divine. But it's not a personal God. It's a different kind of force. It's more like a sublime force that exists whether we understand it or not. It's still there. We can't ignore it. But whether we understand it or not is up to each person. Comparing that to Hopkins' God's Grandeur, written in 1877, they're very different. So Hopkins, of course, was writing in the Victorian era, but still heavily influenced by Romanticism. He was a Jesuit priest, which I think is by far the most important fact. So already going into this poem, you got to know that his view of nature is already going to have very Catholic ties. He believes that the natural world is charged with God's energy, and a very famous line from this poem is, "The world is charged with the grandeur of God." So unlike Shelley, Hopkins sees nature as a way of God coming into our lives. He is active and he is loving. Even when humans ruin the environment, which definitely ties into his time period that he was writing in, God restores it like Jesus restored the sin of man. God's beauty still shines through us, and his beauty in his creation is a way for us to tangibly see that. It's hopeful and very spiritual, as he is a Jesuit priest. He's very technical, so he used very rich sound and rhythm, and of course religious imagery to get that across. He was a very technical poet, which ties into his poem. So then, now with some of those comparisons, there are definitely very clear differences. So the biggest one, in my opinion, is the view of divinity. Shelley sees this divinity as a powerful but impressionable force in nature. It's something in the background, but it's there. Hopkins believes it is a personal, loving God. He sees it as a way for humanity to connect with a personal, loving God and our Creator. So with the tone, Shelley's tone is awestruck and very philosophical. He definitely ties into that force in the background, whereas Hopkins is much more devotional and hopeful, as he was very devoted to God and devoted to his order of the Jesuits. The structure, so Shelley writes in these long, flowing verses, and it gives that feeling of being in nature and being in tune with that. Whereas Hopkins uses a tightly structured sonnet with a rhythm called sprung rhythm, which gives it a unique beat. I think that very heavily ties into God being God. It's unique. You can't replicate what it is. You can't replicate nature. It's its own thing. It's unique. And then the way humans interact with nature in these poems is very different. So Shelley thinks that the human mind reflects nature, but again can't fully understand it. It's something that's in our mind. We see it, but we don't really we can't really completely understand it. Whereas Hopkins says that humans have understood it and damaged it, but God renews it. And then now we have those differences, but there's a lot of similarities too. So there's more similarities than I went over before. So they both were amazed by the natural world. They both saw the beauty in nature. Both poets explore big spiritual questions, so both try to tie that in to human spirituality, and both are reflective of their backgrounds. Both write with very strong emotion and very vivid images. They were both very passionate about what they were writing about, and it shows in their poems. And both show nature as much than more scenery. They went beyond that. They went to that spiritual level. They went to that, like, the mental level of what it is and what it, like, shows. Then we both, even though Hopkins came later, both very heavily tie into these romantic ideas of the sublime power of nature. Shelley really ties into that. He ties into the uses of imagination in the sense of isolation and wonder, that you are your own person, and that some understand nature and some don't, but it's your own unique experience. Hopkins fits it in with romantic ideas by tying into the nature and deep spiritual connection, which is very heavy in romantic poems, but he uses it to tie into his Catholic spirituality rather than the nature spirituality that Shelley kind of tied into. So then I would like to just compare some quotes so you can see the contrast and where they're coming from. So a line from Shelley's poem ends, "And were that thou, the earth, stars, and sea, if to human minds' imaginings silence and solitude were vacancy." This shows his deep and almost philosophical view of nature and the mind. Like you can tangibly see in his poem the intangibility of nature and the difference in that. Whereas Hopkins talks about, he ties into that Catholic feeling. A quote from him is, their lives the dearest freshness of deep down things. So he's talking about like the refreshingness of God and the refreshingness that nature plays in our lives. So even though we damage it, nature is still there, and it, in the way that like trees can regrow and nature regrows itself and comes back to us, is the same way that God, even though when we sin, he still comes back to us, and he still shows himself in our lives. I definitely connect more with Hopkins's hopeful message about like the spiritual renewal and the fixing that God can have on us with sin. But both poems made me stop and think about nature in a much deeper way. Both poems use that heavy emotion. Their tones, their structure definitely add to different feelings, like the different ways that they describe nature, the different ways you feel towards nature. And both, again, that spiritual tie, that whether we're just observers of something great or it's just something great that we're seeing, has a deeper undertone that is trying to explain to us. So just to wrap up all this up, Shelley and Hopkins both use nature to explore ideas about the divine and our place in the universe. But where Shelley finds mysterious, overwhelming power, and it's not where God is, Hopkins finds God's grace and renewal in nature. Both their poems have different tone and message, but both show how nature can be a window into something greater than ourselves. Thank you so much for listening.